Hey everybody, we're going to go through Political and Trade Forces, Chapter 6. Sorry I am not available this week, but there will be a quiz on this for you to take when I get back. And so take good notes, and this information is also going to be on the next test, so make sure you take the time to go through it. So political forces are a significant consideration anytime a business considers going overseas or into another foreign market. It really needs to understand what political forces it's going to face as it plans its operations. If you're entering a market where there's a welcoming political atmosphere, it will allow your business to flourish even though the country may be poor in natural resources, or it might not be the best location from a cultural standpoint. However, if the opposite holds true and you move into a market where the political atmosphere is very business, um, it's dangerous for business. You'll find those environments are very poor business supporting environments, and they're also economically poor as well. You'll see that as we go through this chapter, primarily because of the hostility against business and the corruption that's in the political system in those countries and the instability in the government. So as we embark on selecting the countries that we want to move into on your project, this is a major area that you want to focus on and get your arms around so that you know what you're doing and you pick a country that's going to support you in your efforts at growing your business. So one of the areas that is hostile in terms of governments against businesses when businesses are nationalized. Nationalization happens whenever a government decides it wants to take over a business. It nationalizes the business. Let's take a look at a couple of examples on this video real quick, and you'll learn a little bit about what nationalization looks like.
Breaking news now out of Venezuela. President Hugo Chavez has seized control of a rice mill owned by U.S. company Cargill.
Chavez has been tightening control over Venezuela's food supply. He's continuing his policy of nationalization. The country suffering food shortages. Chavez says Cargill is not complying with government quotas and pricing.
Cargill is not the only company targeted by Chavez. Venezuela's largest food company, Polar, is also in Chavez's sights, but that company is taking the case to court.
Cement in the hands of the state. After nationalizing the oil, the electricity, and the telecommunications, Venezuela has taken over the country's foreign-owned cement companies.
What Chavez asks for is what the people ask for. Now is the time for the cement companies to finally be in the hands of the state, in the hands of the government.
Chavez says the move will enable him to launch massive housing and construction plans to continue to develop the country. Swiss-owned Holcim and French-owned Lafarge signed an agreement with Venezuela Monday to hand over shares of their local units. The buyout cost Venezuela just over $800 million. Details of the compensation talks have not been made public, but Chavez claims the move will result in lower cement prices. An agreement, however, has yet to be reached with the Mexican cement giant Cemex, which now faces expropriation. Venezuela aims to have at least 60% ownership of cement companies and says private companies can keep minority shares, and Chavez's nationalization spree is far from over. Banks are expected to be next, with plans to take over Spanish-owned Banco Venezuela.
So you can see a couple of examples of nationalization. Venezuela in the past has been a nationalizer, And you can see that the primary focus of this video was all on Venezuela and how Venezuela essentially took over business interests for several reasons. One was corruption. Venezuela's government's well known to be very highly corrupt. And so there was a profit motive there. But of course, the message that Chavez sent was that it was for the benefit of the citizens of his country. And one could argue against that. But essentially, there are several reasons why firms are nationalized in a country. First, if the government suspects the company is concealing profits, it will nationalize the firm in order to extract money. The government can also take over because it thinks it can run the company more profitably, or it wants to adjust prices to benefit people in the country, citizens in the country, or the government itself. If it wants to preserve jobs, several instances in the past had to do with government taking over business because the business was going to be closed and they didn't want to lose the jobs associated with it. So if there's a dying industry in a particular area, the government may just take over the business and run it to maintain jobs. And then the government can also take over industries and businesses when it needs them for war machine creation, and that happened during the German World War II era, where Germany took over several businesses simply because it wanted to be able to create tools of war and support its war effort. Well, there are arguments that nationalization does create unfair competition. And of course, it can create unfair competition. In fact, you heard Chavez say in his video that he planned on cutting prices. So they can eliminate profitability completely. They don't have to be profitable, which means they can cut costs and prices significantly and compete against the other private industries and drive them out of business. So it's sort of unfair. They can obtain cheap financing because they're a government. They can tax. They have the right to tax citizens, so they can obtain very, very inexpensive financing if they so choose. Government contracts. They can force all government contracts to flow through their new business, and government contracts can be cut from private industry, and they can basically control wages much more effectively and get export assistance directly because they can negotiate export deals with other countries. So there are some pretty good reasons why this argument holds true, and we've seen in the past when there has been nationalization that that's exactly what happens. Now, the other side of the coin is privatization. Privatization is the transfer of public sector assets to the private sector. So it's the sale of government-owned businesses back to the private shareholders and private equity interests. And privatization is can be a good thing in general. We in the United States believe that privatizing virtually anything and everything is always better. At least that's the general consensus. However, there have been times where there have been certain industries, certain activities that have been privatized, and it's been to the detriment of our country. And there's one example I'd like to show you that's been in argument for a number of years, and this gives you an idea, and perhaps you should consider the arguments that are being presented in this video.
American Civil Liberties Union, in 2010, the two largest prison companies alone received nearly $3 billion in revenue, while their top executives Each received annual compensation packages worth more than $3 million. Private prisons didn't really exist before the early 1980s, when US states and the federal government needed a solution to the overcrowding in public prisons. But between 1990 and 2009, the number of people in private prisons increased by a massive 1,600%. And the business model of these private prison companies essentially depends on locking more and more people up. The biggest of the US's private prison companies is the Corrections Corporation of America, otherwise known as the CCA. In its 2010 annual report to shareholders, the CCA stated, "The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal laws." The CCA seems to be particularly concerned about the decriminalisation of drug use and any potential changes to immigration laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Because of these concerns, private prison companies spend a lot of money on lobbying politicians. According to analysis by the Associated Press, between 2002 and 2012, the CCA, along with the US's second and third largest private prison companies, Geo Group Inc. and Management and Training Corporation, otherwise known as MTC, spent around $45 million on lobbying state and federal governments between them. And in addition to lobbying, these three companies also pour hundreds of thousands of dollars every year into the election campaigns of governors, state legislators, and judges. And a report by the National Institute on Money and State Politics revealed that between 2003 and 2011, the CCA alone hired 199 lobbyists in 32 states, while GEO hired 72 lobbyists in 17 states. Worryingly, private prisons in America have been linked to numerous cases of violence and poor conditions.
So there's an example of privatization, and that may not have or may not be working well. It encourages certain behavior and activities that may not be in the public's best interest. But that's really up to you to consider and think about. It's important for us to know both the positives and negatives associated with privatization. Lots of great positive things positive results in privatization, but perhaps if you take it a little too far, certain industries in privatization without some sort of structure or rules might not be the best fit. So the government's primary job is to not only protect its citizens, certainly, but also to protect business and economic activities. If it does not do that well, it ends up really becoming unstable for business. The problem is there are several countries out there that are not very effective at managing and assuring protection of both citizens and business. So you, as international business students, really need to be knowledgeable on the kind of protections that the governments afford or provide you as business people, and the risks associated with doing business in other countries. There are several, and we'll take a look at a few just in a minute. Terrorism, of course, is another area that is high on everybody's list right now. An area of big concern all over the world. We'll look at a risk map here soon and take a look at where the highest and lowest risks are. And I would highly recommend, while you're researching countries to do business in, that you take a look at this Aon risk map and learn a little bit about it. But there are several organizations in the world right now, including Al Qaeda, the Irish Republican Army, Hamas, Hezbollah, Abdul Nidal, and other Islamic fundamentalist groups all over, the Basque separatist movement, the Japanese Red Army, and the German Red Army faction. And then, of course, we have our own homegrown terrorists as well, all over the world. So, major area of influence in business, and something to certainly consider. Let's take a look at a risk map that we can find at www.riskmaps.aon.co.uk. I would highly recommend you take a little bit of time and take a look at this risk map. You can register for this as a student. I already have an account, so I'm going to go ahead and log in. And I can take a look at basically Aon's heat map on the risks associated with both political risks and terrorism risks. Right now I'm looking at political risks, and I can select all kinds of different risks: legal and regulatory, political violence risk, risk of doing business. I think I'll choose risk of doing business. And this helps really identify if I want to look at ratings. Very high would be red, severe would be orange, light orange is medium high, medium low, and not rated. As you can see, there are very few low ratings here. It looks like Africa is filled with very high risk. Now, what that means is that there's risk of being kidnapped, there's risk of doing any kind of business there, having to deal with bribery, making sure your goods get delivered effectively without being taken from you. Those are the kind of risks that exist in these countries that are in red. Risk that here's Venezuela, that's red. Risk that your assets will be taken from you by the government. Here's red in Cuba. And so there's significant risks, and then there's some less risky areas as well. But as you're considering where to do business, you'll see that there are sections of this map that aren't rated, and primarily because they're very, very low risk, probably, and so that's something to consider. You can also look at a terrorism map on here and take a look at where the highest and lowest terrorism and what's happening in the world. And you can see there are a number of areas with blinking dots that signify a terrorist activity or recent terrorist activity in the area, and that seems to be growing and expanding year by year as well. And you've seen that in the news. So take a look at this when you and your group get together to talk about where you want to do business and how you want to roll your company out. This is a very helpful tool for you to consider. What we're talking about also when we look at some of these things is the stability of government itself. A stable government is able to maintain itself in power and keep fiscal, monetary, and political policies predictable. What we want in business is predictability and stability. An environment that's stable and predictable allows business to thrive. When it's unstable, the government's not capable of maintaining power, is not able to control fiscal, monetary, and political policies. It becomes extremely unpredictable, which means, unfortunately, it's a very dangerous area, an unstable area for you to do business in. An example is Zimbabwe. So let's take a look at this video, and I think you'll find that because Zimbabwe's political and economic condition is unstable, this is what can happen when you're in an extremely unstable economic environment.
You want to create a stunning website. I've already done it with Wix. Let me show you how it's done. I mean, I'm gonna need.
July 30th, and with the stroke of a pen, there were no more trillionaires, quadrillionaires, or quintillionaires in Zimbabwe. This followed the slashing of 10 zeros from the Zimbabwean currency by the central bank. The redenomination of the currency meant that $1 trillion turned into just $100, $100 billion into $10, and $10 billion into just $1. The move was aimed at curbing hyperinflation, but it appears it has had no effect on the economic disaster in the once prosperous Southern African country. The rate of inflation continues to skyrocket. The Central Statistics Office in Harare puts the inflation rate at 11.2 million%, the highest in the world. Experts believe it could be much higher. But just what does an 11.2 million% rate of inflation mean? In Harare, they call it the hour economy. Prices of goods change by the hour. It has been a gradual increase in prices of goods. In November last year, when the governor of the central bank slashed off 3 zeros from the currency, a loaf of bread and other basic commodities cost a few hundred Zim dollars. By December, you needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy a bread. By January, a loaf of bread and things like tomatoes were costing millions. By April, it was billions. The old currency will still be in use until the 31st of December. Supermarkets have to quote each item in both currencies until the end of this month as Zimbabweans try to adjust to the new figures. A cash shortage has gripped Zimbabwe after the central bank set a withdrawal limit. Individuals and companies are allowed to withdraw 300 Zimbabwean dollars a day. That's just $1 US. For now, Zimbabweans are welcoming the convenience that comes with dealing with smaller notes and figures as they peg their hopes for economic recovery on talks between the ruling ZANU-PF and the opposition movement for democratic change.
Well, there's an example of what can happen when a government becomes unstable. What was it, 11 million, over 11 million% inflation created several trillionaires. Of course, their money was almost worthless. So, and that's because of the unstable political and economic environment in that country. So that's what can happen if you don't manage your government well, and that's a business area that has a very high risk because, imagine having to change your price every hour to accommodate the increase increase in the inflation rate, and that becomes an almost impossible area and country to do business in. So let's take a look at international companies. International companies are large. Over half the world's largest economic units are firms. If you recall, we looked at a map or a list a while back that showed that several countries had lower GDPs than many of these international companies. So the companies' GDPs were higher than several countries' incomes. So they have significant political influence because as they invest in a country, they create jobs and opportunities for citizens, and so they have an opportunity to really manipulate or be involved in the political process, and they are, and they get involved in the political process. So it's important to understand that as companies grow and prosper internationally, they have political influence, and this stabilizes countries, to be honest, because they want to encourage additional and further business growth. So where you see international companies popping up in different countries, those are the countries that you may want to consider doing business in as well, because it's going to become more and more stable. One thing that you'll end up doing is a country risk assessment. This is something that you have to do in order to evaluate the risk of a country. So we've talked a little bit about different types of risks, and in the next video we'll talk specifically about more related to this country risk assessment, which is part of your assignment.